Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good evening. My name is Raul Flores. I am the Public Program and Development Officer at Doris. Tonight, we have a wonderful event. It is called On Hart Island, Past, Present, and Future. And the host is Melinda Hunt, an award-winning documentarist, a filmmaker, and the president of the Hart Island Project. Melinda, I pass the mic to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to see you today, and I hope that you will post your questions so that we'll have time at the end for some answers. And just to say up front that if any of you want to reach out to me following this, you can reach me at hartisland.net. There's a contact form, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Okay, so start out with a land acknowledgement about Hart Island. Hart Island and its surrounding waters are the traditional territory of the Wappinger and Munsee Lenape people. The Sinuwe or Salt people resided in these environments, gathered food, hunted animals in the woodlands, and fished in areas just offshore of Hart Island. Glacial boulders deposited on Hart Island long ago remind us that this land is sacred to Native peoples. We commit to uplifting, honoring, and listening to those who are seen and unseen, past, present, and future. So I'm going to begin with two quotes from historians that have written about Hart Island. The first one is Ken Jackson, who many of you may know through Columbia, used to teach a course on New York City history. And he published a book in the 1990s called Silent Cities. And he wrote, in every period of history and every landmass on the globe, provide evidence that cemeteries are collective representations of deeply shared attitudes and assumptions. And Hart Island is certainly part of all of our histories and our experience of living in New York City. Another historian that I worked with is Thomas LeCure, who's emeritus professor of history at UC Berkeley. And he wrote a book called The Work of the Dead that came out in 2015. I very much recommend that book if you are interested in the history of cemeteries in Western Europe and the United States in particular. And when I interviewed him, he said that we, the living, are between the dead and the future. And so we have to care for that past, for that history. And this is a photograph I'm showing you that is a drone photograph taken from above the chapel on Hart Island and overlooking an area where all of the people who died during COVID are buried. And I'm going to show you now a video that was taken at the peak of the pandemic in April of 2020.
You will return to dust. You will return to dust. Turn to the sun. Like me, turn stopped beating. Turn to peace. Turn to peace. This is the only road that leads you home. And I am your pale companion. I mirror your pain. I was your shadow. All those long nights, all those days long past. Listen to me, listen to me. This message is for you. Where I am now, all sorrow is gone. Where I am now, all lovers are together. Where I am now, in my arms only will you find rest. Gentle rest.
Okay, so I wanted to show you that video right up front before going into any of the background about Hart Island, because that video seemed to many people to be somewhat shocking during COVID, that New York City was conducting mass burials. And somehow that looked to everyone around the world as just a terrifying thing. In fact, what we're seeing with this image is the very last day after more than 150 years of inmates performing the burials on Hart Island. This was the very last day. So this is a burial process that is poorly understood. It is a burial process that's very, very important to New York City, because when you have periods of epidemics, when the private funeral system becomes overwhelmed, New York City can scale up very, very quickly. And in this particular video, what you're seeing is 24 bodies buried within an hour before 8:30 in the morning. And prior to the pandemic, burials were conducted 1 day a week. The city was able to scale up to 5 days a week very, very quickly. And what you're seeing with these burials is actually not anyone who died of COVID. This is during the pandemic, April 2nd, 2020. But all of the bodies that you're seeing are actually bodies that of people who died late in 2019 or in January, February of 2020, and whose families had not had taken some time to agree to a city burial. So the people that were dying in April during the pandemic, most of them were not really buried until September or October. And the freezer trucks that you were seeing around the city were an attempt by New York to allow people enough time to make a decision as to whether or not they wanted a city burial, which is a green burial on Hart Island, or whether or not they wanted a private burial. And for many families, it was very stressful having a loved one's body left on a freezer truck for months and months. But it was a fantastic service, really, very expensive to the taxpayers, but a fantastic service to not inadvertently send anyone for burial on Hart Island. I think what was missing with the city policy on that is not to really show the burials, to leave it to filmmakers like me or to the AP, who was out there a few days later, to show these burials and then to not have it properly explained that the reason we have this burial process is because New York City has had many epidemics. And this system of burials is what works during an epidemic, especially if you have these freezer trucks and you can hold the bodies for long enough for the private funeral industry to catch up. So I just wanted to lay that out there, that what I'm going to cover with this is mostly the history of this particular burial process, which is unique to New York City and is just, in my opinion, a fantastic service to the city, to the citizens of New York City. And to the rest of the world. Lots of people buried on Hart Island come to New York City for end-of-life care. They never maybe lived in New York City. They come to the city for a heart transplant. They're very, very seriously ill, and some of them don't make it. It's very expensive to transport a body across state lines, and many people do, families do agree to a city burial if somebody dies in New York City. So it's not just New Yorkers who are buried on Hart Island, but people from all over the world. It's an international city. So how did we get this burial process, which is so continuous? During the Civil War, Hart Island was leased by the Union to train both Union soldiers, 3 regiments of United States colored troops who could not train in Manhattan because there were race riots going on there. And later in the war, it became a prisoner of war camp for 3,412 Confederate soldiers. If the war had gone on, there were plans for Hart Island to have up to 10,000 Confederate prisoners of war. So this is an etching that appeared in the Illustrated Times of London at the end of 1865. Showing the disbandment of the Federal Army, and you can see quite a few buildings there up on the hill, and you can see down here actually there were probably some burials during the war, not Confederate soldiers, but Union soldiers who died during training were buried there during the war, and this stable that would have received, would have had horses and whatnot and received goods. So this is the eastern side of Hart Island and what it looked like at the end of the Civil War. So Hart Island is actually connected to our most famous cemetery, the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, where I'm sure most of you know that the Gettysburg Address was the dedication of the cemetery at Gettysburg. And it was, according to Thomas LeCure, the first time since Marathon, Greece, that the common soldier who died on the battlefield was honored in his burial on the battlefield. And so following Gettysburg, it became quite important to be able to keep track of Union soldiers who died on the battlefield. And so what they wanted to do is to be able to bury soldiers on the battlefield, Most of the battles, as you know, were in the South. They needed to be able to bury soldiers quickly and such that they could disinter them and move them to national cemeteries later on. So here we have Gettysburg, where, as you know, soldiers were buried in their regiments, so within their community, and honored for giving their life to the Union. Within Gettysburg, there are unknown burials. So they had this problem of if someone dies on the battlefield and the bodies aren't buried quickly, how do you keep track of who's who? And so as the war progressed, they came up with this system of burials of using ledgers to bury 150 bodies in a grave. It's a grid. There were 3 layers, and the system of ledgers that was the key to where each body was within this plot. And that system of burials is something that, because the United States Sanitary Commission was embedded at Bellevue Hospital, which had the first morgue in North America, and there were morgues in the Union Army as well, that this system of burials, of reconciling death and keeping track of it, was developed during the Civil War as it progressed. And invariably, the people who conducted the disinterments and the reburials were United States colored troop young men of color. And when I started going to Hart Island during the AIDS epidemic in 1991 and 1992, it was all African American and Hispanic young men convicted of misdemeanors, which requires that you work in New York City, who were conducting these burials. Okay, so the Sanitary Commission was embedded at Bellevue Hospital and concerned with reconciling death following the war. And they introduced the first medical examiner in North America, which was at Bellevue, to the idea of photographing the dead who were unidentified and using the system of ledgers and these plots of 150, these highly organized burial plots. And the advantage of this for New York City was that it allows the city to disinter. And according to New York state law, sepulcher laws require that each municipality bury unclaimed human remains. They must be buried. And if the family did not agree to a municipal burial, then the municipality is required to return the remains to families. And in New York City, that's up to 30 years. So a whole generation, essentially. This is a really fantastic service. I've worked with many families who have asked for disinterments, and for the family to be able to regain control over the remains of their loved one and have a funeral and have a burial of their choice, it really makes a difference in families. So for the same reason that this system of burials worked for the Union Army, it also works for New York City. And there are about 40 to 85 or so disinterments every year, going back, as I said, 30 years. And it's the structure of these burials that is so important. Before the city adopted this grid system, it was very, very difficult for them to find individual graves. And so particularly when you have the chaos of an epidemic, this is a much more secure choice, actually, than hiring a funeral director who can't keep up with the demand. So sanitary codes were passed in 1866, removing burials from Manhattan. There's still some active cemeteries in Manhattan, but they opened before 1866. And so New York City then purchased Hart Island in 1868. And the Department of Charities and Correction was a new agency that was created in 1866, and that agency purchased Hart Island, which was in Westchester County, part of Pelham. And so it was part of New York City before the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, or Staten Island. And it was 16 miles from Manhattan. And one of the reasons they purchased the island was that there were a number of buildings that we saw in the slide that could be used to house older boys from the House of Refuge that was on Randall's Island. And young men convicted of misdemeanors, or anyone convicted of misdemeanors in New York City, there's a work requirement. And so one of the jobs that was assigned to these young men, older boys from the House of Refuge, as they said, was to bury the dead. And that went on really until deinstitutionalization laws were passed in 1963, and the city lost its funding to run the workhouse on Hart Island, and so it closed in 1966. And still the Department of Correction was required to continue to bus inmates from Rikers Island out to Hart Island. And that continued right up until April 2nd during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's the importance of that video from a historic perspective. It looked like something new, but in fact, it was something that had happened continuously since 1872 to 75 was when the city fully implemented the burial process. In 2019, the City Council passed new administrative codes that ended the role of the Department of Correction on Hart Island, and the Human Resource Administration, which is the contemporary name for the Department of Charities, was always on the code and is still on the code, and they took over conducting the burials. And New York City Parks Department has now taken over management of the landscape and visitation. Okay, so here's the Department of Charities and Correction. They're building in 1868 at 10th Street and 3rd Avenue. I think that's like an NYU dorm now, that location. And they had jurisdiction over the almshouse, the workhouse, the House of Refuge, the jail, the public hospitals, the reformatories, the asylums, and municipal burials. Like all of that was this one fairly corrupt city agency. And the medical examiner opened a place for dissection on East 26th Street, which is still where the morgue is today as part of Bellevue Hospital. And so both Hart Island and Bellevue are still performing their original function at their original location. So here's Bellevue Hospital in 1880, showing the Hart Island ferry dock, and a drawing of what the morgue looked like in 1875 and what it looked like in 1999 when I was able to photograph in there. And unknowns were always photographed so that families could come identify the remains before disinterment. And since 9/11, DNA samples have been kept on file. And the medical examiner actually went back to Hart Island and collected DNA samples of all the people who were buried as unknowns in the 1990s. So those are now part of national databases. And as I said, the city disinters if the family requests it for free. Corpses not used for dissection or medical training were taken to a dead house. And up until 2016, most bodies, anybody who donated their body to medicine and didn't check the box asking for the remains to be returned to their family, those people were also buried on Hart Island. And then the state passed a law requiring, this was in 2016, requiring that families the city could not use a body for medical training or research without family permission. And then all of the medical schools then were required to cremate or return the remains to families. So at that point, none of the bodies that were embalmed and used for medical research were going to Hart Island. So now it really is the largest green cemetery in the country. There's no embalming. Everyone's buried in a plain pine box. And so I think it's the only green burial option that's really affordable to people in New York City. Okay, so this is a photograph of the morgue workers loading coffins from the dock at the end of East 26th Street. And that dock was in operation actually until the FDR was built. And after that, the bodies were then transported mostly by truck to Hart Island, but on occasion, they have gone by boat more recently from Wall Street or other locations in Manhattan, up the East River, through the Hell's Gate and on to Hart Island. So again, 16 miles from Manhattan. And inmates from Blackwell's Penitentiary traveled with the dead to Hart Island. And in addition to the boxes that were loaded onto the steamer called the Fidelity, bound for various hospitals, there were patients also from Bellevue traveled to the various institutions on Blackwell's and Randall's and Ward's Island. So you had the living and the dead going together on the same boat. And I think it was a little bit of a horror, actually, if you were sick, to get on a boat with a lot of boxes and coffins. So that obviously isn't something that's done anymore. And it was described that this was a horrifying thing to actually be moved around on the same boat that took the dead and collected the dead from various hospitals and moved them to Hart Island. So this is a Jacob Riis photograph showing young men from the reformatory. Jacob Riis's photographs are early 1890s, not dated exactly, but 1890, 1891. And the young men, up to 2,000 young men convicted of misdemeanors lived on Hart Island. And then you have also the prisoners from Blackwell's Penitentiary unloading the morgue wagon and loaded into trenches that were dug by the inmates on Hart Island. And this area, this is Jacob Riis's very first photograph on Hart Island, showing these willows in the background. Some of those trees or similar trees, similar willows, are still at that location. So this compares just those two scenes from 1890 and then 100 years later, an adult burial on February 7th, 1992. So Hart Island was intended to be a rural cemetery with an organized grids, paths and plantings, and just like Woodlawn and Greenwood, but without monuments. And so everybody on Hart Island is essentially buried the same. It's a very, very democratic cemetery, and you don't have the sense of a social hierarchy that you have when you visit a private cemetery, where some people have very large monuments and some people have nothing. Some people have unmarked graves in private cemeteries, and some people have very modest graves. But everybody is buried exactly the same on Hart Island. So starting out in 1872, it was 3 layers of 50 per layer and 3 stacked up. And starting in 1931, after Rikers Island opened and the prison really closed, at Blackwell's Penitentiary closed, the prison continued to stay open on Hart Island as a branch of Rikers. And in 1931, they changed the layout so that it was 3 sections of 50 of 50 graves. Each box is a grave, and infant plots of 1,000 babies. So that is really unchanged today. And this is a photograph of the earliest ledger book of city burials from May 1872 through to February 1875. And this is now, I lobbied for several years for this to be transferred from the Department of Correction to the Municipal Archives. So I'm hoping that it by now is probably on microfilm. But you can see just on the pages the locations where people came from: Bellevue Hospital, the smallpox hospital on Roosevelt Island, the Charity Hospital on Roosevelt Island, the insane asylum also on Roosevelt Island. All of these places that were all controlled by the Department of Charities and Correction. So again, a comparison of this is part of what interested me in going to Hart Island, that something in New York City was so completely unchanged over a century, that you would still have this process of handing boxes into a plot by inmates. And now they use a forklift to drive the boxes into the plot, which you saw in that video. But it was basically these boxes being handed to inmates up until 2017. And when I photographed was working on a book with Joel Sternfeld, and we photographed Hart Island for a period of about 3 years using the same kind of camera that Jacob Rees used, a land camera. And so the inmates had to stand very still to be photographed, but I could sense that they wanted to talk. So I requested permission to go back and collect testimonials. So I didn't interview the inmates, but I just asked them if they could write down how they felt about performing these burials. And this one inmate, I collected a series of about 30 of them. Many of the inmates were very personally connected to the burials on Hart Island. A member of their family had been buried, or a friend of theirs had been buried. And it struck me that they were performing this service as a way of mourning for a loss within their family, and wanting to pay their debt to society by doing something that they felt was important. So the inmates were very low classification inmates, which means they were convicted of things like turnstile jumping, fare evasion. Were very young, basically barely old enough to be in prison. And now with the bail reform, most inmates convicted of these kinds of crimes are not actually even going to prison. So what happened during COVID is essentially the city ran out of inmates to conduct the burials, and they very quickly had to hire a landscaping company to take over the burials, still supervised by the Department of Correction up until October 2021. And here's a ledger that shows the burials from that day. The inmates would write the name of the person as it appeared on the burial permit. They would carve a grave number on top with a router, and the burial permit is attached to the end of the box. So if the body needs to be disinterred, they have all the paperwork there. They go in from the side so they don't disturb any of the other bodies within a plot, and remove the remains from the end. And it's about an hour-long process. It's actually a very, very efficient thing that happens on Hart Island only during the warm months. They're probably done for the year this November, and will not be doing disinterments again until the spring. Okay, so I'm going to show you, this is the opening titles where I used one of the ledgers from the Municipal Archives as a form of storytelling. So it's the opening title to my film, Hart Island American Cemetery, that came out, I guess in 2007. I started it in 1999.
The last bit of thread that I had left, lucky me that last thread wasn't severed. In the last few weeks, I was able to see my brother and niece on almost a daily basis. I might have seen my brother more this week than I had seen him in the last 10 years put together. My niece, many years went by in between so-called seeing her, if I was able to see through the drug-induced haze. Maybe 30 years since my brother, my mother, my father, and myself sat down for a meal. I can't say with enough enthusiasm, or it won't come across right, but I guess, I'm one of the lucky ones. Yes, I have AIDS, and I have some regrets, but at least I still am in contact with my family. I was raised in that family comes first. Family is, the strength in family ties are very important. And, over the last 25, 30 years, that was very hard for me to believe. Because when I experienced some problems for the very first time, the same people who told me how much they loved me just ran and everybody scattered in different directions, like roaches do when you put the switch on in the light at nighttime.
Stranger, if you passing meet me and desire to speak to me, why should you not speak to me? And why should I not speak to you? Only themselves understand themselves and the like of themselves, as souls only understand souls. I wander all night in my vision, stepping with light feel, swiftly and noiselessly stepping and stopping, bending with open eyes over the shut eyes of sleep. Wandering and confused, lost to myself, ill-assorted, contradictory, passing, gazing, bending and stopping.
Okay, so that was a family that came over from Ireland to visit the grave of an uncle who had worked for the city of New York and had been a member of a church. And for some reason, his family was not notified and his church wasn't notified. And they figured it out. And in 1999, I negotiated with the Department of Correction that they should be able to visit Hart Island. They then ordered a disinterment and reburied their uncle in Ireland. So that was one of the first disinterments that I worked on. And I could see how it was very, very important for people to be able to visit, to gather the family, to be able to have the funeral that didn't happen, and then to move on with their lives. And so a lot of the Hart Island Project has been advocating for families to have access to graves and to be able to freely visit without being escorted by a correction officer, and access to the records where you can search them online at your own on your own schedule, and ability to add a story and not be charged by a service that's going to expire in a year and is monitored. So from working with law firms to get the ledgers and to put them online and then to develop software, it's all an effort to try to reconnect Hart Island, reconnect City Cemetery to New York City, to make it function as a cemetery, which is a place of reconciliation, a place where stories are told, where families can visit, and they can figure out how to reconcile the death of a loved one. And so all of the work of the Hart Island Project is really toward that end. And this is a photo of Elsie Soto, whose father died of AIDS when she was about 10 years old, with her daughter visiting on Palm Sunday. And the location of the little memorial that she brought is actually the actual place within the plot that her father's body is. So it's a plot of 150, but the city knows where each body is within that plot. It's one of those things that if you have to disinter 40 to 80 times a year, you're relatively careful about how you put these boxes in the ground so that it's pretty easy to get them out. So that is Elsie has chosen not to disinter her father, but she visits regularly, and we went there just last weekend. So this is what that location looked like. This is a few months after her father, Norberto, was buried. So you can see that it looks quite different. And from the video I showed you earlier, the land is really feels disturbed and whatnot. But within 10 years or so, it heals relatively quickly. And we're hoping the Parks Department will develop a landscape plan and fully restore Hart Island as a woodland cemetery, which is what natural burials are usually in woodland areas. So this is what that area looks like today. Most of these grave sites they're all from the 90s, and ones in the further background are very early AIDS burials. The city was burying 5 days a week during the AIDS epidemic when I first started going there. So when COVID started, I don't think even in 2020 that the city even went up to the level of burials that they were conducting during the AIDS epidemic. There are some individual graves on Hart Island. The Department of Correction in the middle of the 1980s was fearful of AIDS burials, putting the bodies of people who died of AIDS in common plots for fear that if they had to disinter them, that the bodies would be contaminated, the graves would be contaminated. It wasn't something that the medical examiner ordered them to do, but they did have this separate area for burying victims of AIDS in basically late 1984 through the beginning of 1986. And this is a marker of the first child to die of AIDS, which I did photograph in 1992 when correctional officers told me where it was. And then I didn't have access to that area again until 2018 when we flew a drone over Hart Island, and I could see it from the drone photographs. I circled it here in red, and then was able to photograph it again in May, also with a drone, showing that it's still in this very isolated location, just a single grave of a child, the first child to die of AIDS in New York City. Okay, so this is a video that actually led to the legislation being reintroduced, and it finally passed. And I got a grant from the Canada Council and the Canadian Artists to have a GPS guided drone tour of Hart Island. So the drone flies over areas where there are known AIDS burials.
Just your mouth, just your love, just your anointing oils, just your name, just your chambers, just your love, and my mother's sons, and my own vineyard, and my soul, just your flock, just your companions, just your kids, just your cheeks, just your neck, just your couch, and my perfume, and my beloved, and my breasts, and my beloved, and my love, just your eyes, and my beloved, and my love, and my beloved, just your shadow, just your fruit, just your banner over me, just your left hand, just your right hand, and my beloved, and my beloved, and my beloved, and my love, and my fair one, and my love, and my fair one, and my dove, just your face, just your voice, just your voice, just your face. Vineyards. beloved, just your flock, and my beloved, and my bed, and my soul, and my soul, and my soul, and my soul, and my mother's house, just your sword, just your mother, just your wedding, just your heart, and my love, just your eyes, just your veil, just your hair, just your teeth, just your lips, just your mouth, just your cheeks, just your veil, just your neck, just your two breasts, and my love, and my bride, and my heart, and my sister, and my bride, and my heart, just your eyes, just your necklace, just your love, and my sister, and my bride, just your love, just your oils, just your lips, and my bride, just your tongue, just your garments, and my sister, and my bride, just your shoots, and my garden, and my beloved, and my garden, and my sister, and my bride, and my myrrh, and my spice, and my honeycomb, and my honey, and my wine, and my milk, and my heart, and my beloved, and my sister, and my love, and my dove, and my perfect one, and my head, and my locks, and my garment, and my feet, and my beloved, and my hand, and my heart, and my beloved, and my hands, and my fingers, and my beloved, and my beloved, and my soul, and my beloved, just your beloved, just your beloved.
Okay, so that's the video that that we used to show where people who had been identified as dying of AIDS and were buried on Hart Island. And then in the process, we also discovered this area where there are another 32 markers you can see here that represent also people who died of AIDS for whom we have no records. So that led to Speaker Corey Johnson actually visiting. We released the video on November 2nd, 2018, and he went out there for World AIDS Day. And it was the first time that an elected official had actually gone to Hart Island and accessed these anonymous AIDS burials. And then by 2019, the City Council voted 45-2 to end penal control on Hart Island, and this is Mayor de Blasio signing the legislation and marking the end of 150 years just before COVID, the onset of COVID. Then just last month, this is the first day that NYC Park Rangers began conducting visitations. I can't tell you what a change that is in terms of the visitor experience. Visits are still limited to, somebody's got their, make sure your microphone's turned off. Visits are still limited to family or close friends of someone buried. But we're hoping that once the buildings are removed and Hart Island is safe for visitors, that it'll open up more broadly. And then this is a photograph of from last Sunday of a family that had waited 20 years to visit, and we're just so happy to be at the gravesite and able to say goodbye to someone that they had missed for a very long time. And I'm just going to end with one last image. This is the Mercury School Ship Cross that marks the place where there had been a school ship program to train these young men from the workhouse to be merchant marines. And it operated on Hart Island for a very short period of time. And in 1875, 2 boys drowned while participating in the program. And they were buried at this location in the quadrants of the cross. So probably these are the oldest burials on Hart Island, although all of this area around here, or even though you don't see markers, there are graves everywhere there, and they've been used over and over. But probably it's just amazing that this little wooden cross with painted river stones is still there. And it was positioned on this hill so that it could be seen by boats in the Long Island Sound. Okay, so I will stop sharing and open it up for questions. I'll leave it to Raul to ask the questions.
Thank you so much, Melinda, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you to all the participants that joined tonight. I'm going to pass the mic to Latonia Jones for questions. Thank you.
Okay, yes, and we have quite a few. During the first video you played, Susan asks, what were those buildings used for and how many COVID bodies are buried there?
Oh, okay. So first question, the buildings were used for the various institutions that were on Hart Island. So they were prison facilities, they were hospital facilities, particularly during the tuberculosis epidemic. They were used as workshop areas. The buildings were last used by Phoenix House, which was the last institution on Hart Island. And now they're used by raccoons and animals that have gone back to Hart Island. So they'll be removed probably within the next year. They're very unstable. How many people who died of COVID are buried there? We developed software tools where people can search for people who died of COVID, and you can anonymously put a ribbon on that person's profile if you know they had COVID. Hospital records are confidential, so we don't know who what people died of unless families or friends identify them as being victims of COVID. So same thing with the AIDS epidemic. All of those places, when I showed the video of flying over those AIDS graves, those are all people who were identified by friends and family as having died of AIDS-related illnesses.
Okay, and Nancy asks, were infants buried on Hart Island treated differently?
No, all infants are treated exactly the same. And up until recently, almost every stillbirth in the city was buried on Hart Island. Now the medical examiner helps women to make a decision, and the city provides burial assistance, which is enough to bury an infant. So that there are still many infants buried on Hart Island, but they are a choice. It's a choice to choose a city burial. So no, everybody's buried exactly the same.
Okay, thank you. Christine asks, mentions she has an ancestor in the hospital at Blackwell's during the Civil War with smallpox. Is there any chance there would be a record of burial at Hart Island?
No, because the Hart Island burials didn't begin until 1868. So if her relative died on Blackwell's Island during the Civil War and the family did not claim the body, then it would have been buried on Ward's Island, which was the potter's field at that time, and is probably still buried on Ward's Island.
Okay, and was there an asylum there?
There was a women's asylum that closed in 1895. It was a branch of all the other asylums. It was called a pavilion. There were many pavilions, and the state took over handling the mental health institutions in 1895 because they were so poorly managed by the city.
Okay, Nancy asks, is it possible to get a copy of a burial permit?
If you are the relative, you can access an immediate relative, that is child, spouse, sibling, parent of someone buried. You can access the dissident's file at the medical examiner. Otherwise, the burial permits are kept at the Department of Health. I don't think they're publicly accessible. So it would be only be cases that went through the medical examiner where the families can access everything that's in the file at the medical examiner. So I don't know if that answers your question fully, but I don't think if someone died in a hospital and they wanted to be buried on Hart Island and that body didn't go through the medical examiner, I don't think you can get a copy of the burial permit, but we list the permit number. It has basically what's in the burial permit. Everything that's in the ledgers is in the burial permit. So in addition to date of burial and grave and plot number. So you wouldn't, in getting a burial permit, you wouldn't get any more information.
And we had a couple of questions during the second video you played with the family members visiting the island about the boat. Robin asks, is that the boat visitors are transported in? And then Betty mentioned that she had worked on Hart Island as a teacher at Phoenix House in the late 1960s. And she said, we were told that some of the buildings we worked in were former Civil War prisons. And she said, we took the ferry to work with a bus taking prisoners to bury people. And she was wondering if that's the same ferry dock that you show in that video.
No, that video is actually the coal dock, and that was a smaller boat. The Michael Cosgrove is the same ferry that has been the ferry since the 1950s, is still used. They might, I don't know, the city might start using a passenger ferry again. There's a transportation bill that there's a study, and they're working out how visitors will go there. But the medical examiner truck drives right onto the Michael Cosgrove. The bus with the inmates used to go right on it, and the family members also access Hart Island on the Michael Cosgrove, except when the Michael Cosgrove is being serviced, and then there's a private ferry that the city hires to perform the same service. If you were told that the buildings were Civil War era buildings, you were misinformed. The Civil War buildings were all wooden. They were built very quickly. They weren't built of brick, and none of those are still there. They were up on the hill, and that area was used for farming. It was used for Nike missile silos, which are still there, but none of the Civil War era buildings have been there for a very, very long time. So basically, there's only one 19th century building there, and all the rest are 20th century.
Okay, Linda asks, may I have the name of the book you mentioned about the history of cemeteries?
Oh, it's called The Work of the Dead by Thomas LaCure, Princeton University Press, 2015.
Dave asks, was there flooding during Superstorm Sandy?
Yes, but they didn't stop the burials. There's flooding frequently, and they have to pump out the water before they continue with the burials. I mean, no one lives there, so it's not the same as if you have flooding in an area where people are living, and there's a city water line to Hart Island, but otherwise there isn't any sanitation or anything that would really be damaged by flooding.
Okay, and then Robin had a few questions. She asked, first, in recent years, whether most of the people buried on Hart Island were on public assistance and or homeless. Is that accurate?
Lots and lots of low-income people are buried on Hart Island, but that's not the only, it's not exclusively low income. So this pauper cemetery thing is a prejudice, really, because until recently, people who donated their bodies to medicine, if they didn't check the box for their remains to be returned to family, they were automatically buried on Hart Island. So you have, 100-year-old people buried on Hart Island. If you live to 100, you're probably not poor. And certainly if you live to 100 and you died in Dakota, you're not poor. And there are people like that buried on Hart Island. So it's everybody's family, everybody's babies for sure. And we don't know the financial status of people who are buried. That's private information. So there are certainly lots and lots of immigrants and lots of victims of disease and lots of victims of crime buried on Hart Island. But is it exclusively a pauper cemetery? No. There's too many people for that. We don't have that many poor people.
Okay. Also, is the 30-year disinterment indicative of the time it takes to return to dust?
Well, the law states that the city is obligated to return remains to family until the body is fully decomposed to skeletal remains. So the city actually probably doesn't have to disinter after 20 years. But yes, that's essentially the law, is that once the body is fully decomposed to skeletal remains, then the obligation to return the remains to family is not there for the city. So some of it is that it becomes difficult once the boxes sort of stay intact for at least 20 years. And once the box disintegrates, then you have compression. And you could see that in the video where you were seeing those long rows that were sort of filled with water. Those are areas where the graves have collapsed, the long trenches have collapsed. And that's because the bodies have decomposed, and the pine coffins also have decomposed. But the pine coffins hold up for quite a long time. So essentially, once the box is gone, it's very difficult to disinter a body.
Okay, and related to that, we had a couple questions. Phil asked how much room is left, and Cliff asked, are the burial plots eventually reused? How has the island not been filled to capacity?
Well, what I learned from spending a lot of time at the Municipal Archives is that they began to recycle graves in 1931. And at first they were recycling graves that were 50 years and older, and then they began recycling graves 25 years and older, and that's why the city has never run out of space on Hart Island. So the older parts of Hart Island now are available for recycling. I don't know if culturally the city will find that acceptable, or the taxpayers would find that acceptable at this point, but it is legal to recycle graves on untitled land. So the Hart Island belongs to the taxpayers. There's no deed for private burial. But one of the important reasons to remove the buildings is the city will gain about another 17 acres of burial space. And at the pre-pandemic rate of burials, that was another 80 or 90 years worth of burials, because it's a very, very efficient system of burials. So no, the city's not running out of burial space. All the private cemeteries are running out of burial space, but not city cemetery.
Thank you. Nancy asks, where can I find the plot number on the burial record from Hart Island?
It's usually at the top of the page, and it's also listed in the when they close a plot or when they switch to a different section, it's listed. So in our database, which goes back to the beginning of the AIDS epidemic to 1980, it's in the profile, and you can search by plot in our database. The other records that are on microfilm at the Municipal Archives, those records, we don't know where those plots are because many of them have been recycled. So there aren't any maps going back. There aren't any real public maps earlier than 2009. And the only one that's really searchable is on our website. So, and we're working on developing navigation tools so that you'll be able to actually use the map on our website to navigate when you're on Hart Island. And we're hoping to have augmented reality software for being able to see who's buried at what location when you go to a particular location. So within 100 feet of a grave, you'll be able to pull up all the profiles of people buried there, so that creates an experience of knowing who is where when you are visiting.
Okay. We had a couple of questions related to the drone footage you showed. Robin asked if drone tours were available for family members of the decedent, and Gregory asked how hard or easy was it to get a permit to fly a drone over Hart Island since entry is restricted.
Oh, we flew a drone from a boat, and you're not allowed to launch a drone in New York City. So we launched a drone from outside of New York City. So just the east side of Hart Island is actually in Nassau County. And then the airspace over Hart Island is controlled by the FAA. And so all of the drone rules for flying a drone are part of FAA licensing. So we only work with drone photographers who are licensed by the FAA. So you don't need a particular permit to fly a drone over Hart Island. You just need to be licensed. So it's not a city. You're not supposed to fly over areas where there are people. So we always launched a drone when there was nobody there. You have to land a drone if any aircraft are in the air. I'm trying to think of all the rules, but we very carefully checked into all the rules to make sure we were in compliance.
Okay. Elaine asks, I think you may have covered something like this, but how can I find a grave location for a grandfather who died at Bellevue Hospital and was buried there per death certificate in 1883?
You can't, because that grave is no longer intact.
Oh, okay. Ala asks, is there a crematory?
No. There were plans for a crematory, and we really do not want that. Hart Island's off the grid, and it would be very expensive to run gas and electric lines. And if you've already got a green cemetery that's good for the environment, why would you start cremating?
Okay, Janice asked whether or not your database lists the ethnic origin in a searchable way.
No, that's not listed in the burial records. And, I think it's up to, families to decide what story they want to tell and to write about, and to friends to write about that person's identity, how they viewed their cultural background. So no, we don't do any of that.
Okay, thank you to Bart and Linda for answering Robin's question about what a green burial is. And then our last question goes to Teresa. I don't know if there's something that you've given any thought to, but she asked whether or not the filmmaker planned to be interred there.
Oh, well, I know various people in the city would love to see me buried there sooner rather than later, probably. But I grew up in Canada, but my family was in New York and purchased a number of plots in Woodlawn Cemetery, and then everybody moved away. So I actually have plots that can't be otherwise used already in the Bronx. So depending on what members of my family decide to do, if they think I'm worth the cost of paying for a woodlawn burial, then I'd probably be buried there, since no one else can be buried there. But and I could have a green burial in Woodlawn too, because it's one of the older plots that doesn't require a concrete vault. But I think, I really encourage people to visit Hart Island before disinterring, because I think it really is a beautiful location, and it is a very, very peaceful place once you get out there. And now that you don't have to contact the penal system, it's not as intimidating as well. So I also don't live in New York City, so I would have to die in the city to be buried there on top of it. So it's more complicated. You can't just, city's only required to bury people who die within the city.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to all of the guests who added so many questions to the chat. I'll throw it to Raul.
Thank you, Melinda, again. What a great program tonight. Thank you for all the participants that joined us. Happy Thanksgiving and have a good evening. Thank you.